A free man walks into the capital of the United States and disappears in a single night. No chase through alleyways, no public outcry, just absence. One day he is holding papers that prove he's free. The next, those papers are gone, and so is his name. In 1841 in Washington, D.C., a black musician is drugged, bound, and hidden in plain sight. By sunrise, he is being prepared for sale like property. How does that happen steps from the nation's courts and lawmakers? And if it can happen to him, how many others vanished the same way, never getting their story back? Come with me into the recorded case that should have shattered every comfortable myth about safe freedom in America. Before we begin, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and type the exact timestamp you are at right now so we can track where this story hits people. To understand the danger Solomon Northup walked into, you have to picture Washington as it was in 1841, a federal city that spoke the language of liberty while allowing human beings to be sold inside its borders. Slavery was legal in the District of Columbia. Slave pens and auctions operated openly. Free black residents lived beside enslaved laborers, and a person's status could be questioned or erased by the wrong encounter. This mattered because Washington wasn't just any place. It was the symbolic center of the nation, where elected officials debated rights while the machinery of bondage ran nearby. And it sat at a crossroads. Traders moved people south from the Upper South and from the district itself. In that environment, kidnapping free black people was not a freak crime, it was a profitable tactic. Contemporary observers wrote about slave stealing, a practice that targeted free black communities and fed the markets farther south. Solomon Northup was born free in New York State. He grew up with the knowledge that black freedom in America was conditional, something you could possess and still have challenged. But he also built a real life. He married, had children, worked, and became known around Saratoga Springs as a reliable man. He could read and write. He played the violin well enough to be hired for dances and gatherings. He was not drifting on the margins, he was rooted. That's what makes his story so unsettling. The trap did not require him to be desperate. It required him to be ordinary, open to work, willing to travel, confident that agreements meant something. In the spring of 1841, two white men approached him with an offer. They presented themselves as traveling entertainers and said they needed a musician. The pay sounded good, the job sounded short. They promised a trip to Washington, D.C, where, they said, performances and opportunities were waiting. Northup agreed and traveled with them, carrying documents that verified his free status. Those papers were not a guarantee, but they were a shield. And the first step in the crime was to take the shield away. Washington was busy when Northup arrived. He moved through public spaces, ate with the men, and spent time around entertainment venues. Then, in the middle of what should have been a normal evening, his body began to fail. Dizziness, weakness, a sudden unnatural fog. Records and Northup's own account indicate he was drugged, enough to disable him, not enough to kill him. He woke in darkness with iron on his wrists and ankles. When he tried to sit up, the chains pulled him back. When he called out, the answer was not help but threat. He was inside a slave pen. This is where people want to believe a simple correction was possible. Say the right words, show the right proof, find a judge. But he had been stripped of proof, and the place he woke inside was designed to make speech dangerous. Northup insisted he was free. In his narrative, the response was intimidation and physical punishment meant to teach him one lesson: the truth would not protect him here. The man Northup later identified as the keeper of that pen was James H. Birch, a slave dealer in Washington. Birch denied wrongdoing when the case later reached court, and the legal system would not deliver the kind of clear accountability the public might expect. But Northup's detailed description of locations, routines, and people fits what historians know about Washington's slave jails and the broader kidnapping practice in the era. The mechanics were brutally efficient. A free black man could be brought into the district by white companions who could vouch for him or claim to. He could be drugged so he could not resist. His papers could be stolen. He could be held out of sight. And even if he reached a courtroom, black testimony against white defendants was often restricted by law, a barrier that protected kidnappers as much as it protected slaveholders. Not long after he was seized, Northup was moved south with other captive black people. He later described confinement, fear, and the constant pressure of silence, because any claim of freedom could be met with violence. Some captives were already enslaved, some may have been kidnapped like him, but once they were in transit, the category slave swallowed everything else. In New Orleans, the logic of the slave market took over. What he encountered there was not improvisation, but procedure. Traders advertised in newspapers, buyers traveled in, inspected bodies, asked about skills, and negotiated prices. People were forced to smile, to stand straight, to answer questions carefully, because the wrong impression could mean being labeled trouble and shipped farther away. Northup described being coached on what to say and what never to say. The market did not only sell labor, it sold a story that made theft look lawful. A trader na. Med Theophilus Freeman appears in Northup's account as the man who handled sales in New Orleans. Whether a buyer believed Northup's insistence that he was free mattered less than the paper Freeman could produce and the authority the market assumed. In that world, a bill of sale could outweigh a life story. The terror was not just that Northup was trapped, but that the trap was surrounded by clerks, receipts, and signatures, tools that made kidnapping resemble business. Northup was given a new name, Platt, as he wrote, and that renaming was not cosmetic, it was strategy. If he was Platt, then Solomon Northup, the free husband and father from New York, could be treated as a story that no longer mattered. He was sold into Louisiana. Over the next 12 years, Northup would be forced through the stages of plantation slavery, sale, relocation, new commands, new threats, and the constant possibility of being sold again. His first enslaver in Louisiana, according to his account and consistent research, was William Ford. Northup described Ford as comparatively kind by the standards of slavery, a phrase that only exists because the baseline was so cruel. Even under a less violent owner, Northup could not leave. He could be separated from his family forever. Ford valued Northup's skills. Northup could build, repair, and plan. He could solve practical problems, and that sometimes gave him slightly different tasks than relentless field labor. But skill in slavery could be dangerous. Or ability could spark resentment, and resentment could turn into punishment. After conflict and pressure tied to plantation authority and debt, Northup was sold again, this time to a man named John M. Tibeats. Northup described Tibeats as volatile and violent. In his narrative, a dispute escalated into an attempt to have him whipped, and later into a situation where Northup believed his life was in immediate danger. The specific sequence is told by Northup with sharp detail. What matters historically is the pattern it illustrates. Enslaved people could be pushed toward death over what would be a workplace argument anywhere else. Northup survived that period through circumstance and intervention by others connected to the plantation's power structure. Survival did not mean safety. It meant the danger had been postponed. He was sold again, and the next owner would define the longest stretch of his bondage, Edwin Epps. On Epps's cotton plantation, Northup endured the relentless logic of quotas, seasons, and punishment. Northup described Epps as a man who combined authority, alcohol, and religion in a chaotic mix, sometimes invoking scripture while enforcing terror. It is one of the most disturbing contradictions in American history, a system that called itself Christian while treating people as livestock. On that plantation, Northup's story intersects with Patsey, an enslaved woman whose suffering and resilience Northup recorded with particular force. Patsey's presence in his narrative exposes the gendered reality of slavery, the way enslaved women were exploited through both labor demands and sexual coercion, and then punished for the very conditions imposed on them. Northup's account is one of the sources that later readers have used to understand how slavery attacked a person from multiple directions at once. body, dignity, family, future. Northup also understood that the biggest threat to him was not only the quota or the overseer's mood, but discovery of his past. Enslavers feared an enslaved person who could write, who understood contracts, who could connect a plantation to the outside world. Northup could read and write, but using that skill openly could mark him as dangerous. So he hid it. He spoke carefully. He used his violin when ordered, because music could make him useful, and usefulness could sometimes delay the worst, even if it could not undo ownership. And he did not wait 12 years to seek help. Years before Samuel Bass arrived, Northup tried to send a letter north. In his narrative, he trusted a white man named John Armsby, who promised to mail it. Northup wrote that Armsby took the letter and then went to Edwin Epps and revealed what Northup had attempted. The plan collapsed, and Northup understood how close he had come to being destroyed for trying to claim his own identity. He survived, but the lesson was permanent. The wrong helper could turn a private hope into immediate danger. So when Bass spoke against slavery, Northup listened differently. Not because a single opinion proved a person's character, but because it offered a rare opening to test whether someone might treat him as a man with a name instead of a problem to be managed. Still, Northup's narrative is not only a record of pain, it is also a record of resistance, including the quiet kind that rarely makes monuments. He remembered who he was. He watched for openings. He weighed risks. He learned that in a world built to erase him, information could be survival. That brings us to the turning point that changes how the whole story works. Northup did not win freedom by running through swamps. He won it by getting a message to the outside world. Distance was the kidnapper's greatest ally. Northup's legal identity existed in New York. His body was trapped in Louisiana. Even if he could reach a northern official, he needed someone willing to believe him and act in a nation that treated black freedom as suspicious. Over time, white laborers and visitors came through Epps's property. Many were complicit, some were indifferent. A few, Northup suggested, were uneasy. The man who mattered was a carpenter from Canada named Samuel Bass. Bass spoke critically of slavery, which in Louisiana could be dangerous. Northup made a choice that could have ended his life. He trusted Bass with the truth. He told him he was a free man illegally held in slavery, with a wife and children in New York. He asked Bass to help him contact people who could prove his identity. It was a gamble on character. If Bass betrayed him, Northup could be punished, sold farther away, or killed. If Bass helped, a door might open. Bass agreed to write letters. Here we have to stay careful. Northup's book describes Bass sending messages to people in New York who knew Northup. What follows is supported by surviving records showing that Henry B. Northup, a white attorney from New York with long-standing ties to the Northup family, took up the case. Henry did not share Solomon's blood, but he shared a name and a commitment to pursue him. Henry gathered affidavits verifying Solomon Northup's free status. He worked through New York's legal mechanisms for recovering free citizens kidnapped into slavery, mechanisms that existed on paper but often failed in practice. He coordinated with officials, secured documentation, and traveled south. In Louisiana, he linked with a local attorney, John P. Waddell, to navigate courts and locate the man known there as Platt. Now imagine what those days felt like on Epps's plantation. A rumor can be a weapon. A whisper can get someone sold. Hope itself can become dangerous if it makes you careless. Yet the inquiries kept coming, and this time they were backed by papers and by a man willing to stand in front of the law and insist, this person is not property. When Henry Northup and his allies confronted Edwin Epps, the process required identification and proof. Northup had to be recognized as Solomon Northup, the free man from New York. Accounts indicate that documentation and witness confirmation were used to establish his identity. The system that had renamed him now had to admit, at least enough to release him, that the name was a lie. In January of 1853, Solomon Northup was freed. 12 years is long enough for a family to change shape around an empty chair. Long enough for children to cross into adulthood with a missing father. Northup returned to New York and reunited with his loved ones. He came back not just as a survivor, but as evidence. Then he faced the next question: what does justice look like when the law helped make the crime possible? Northup sought accountability. He identified the men he said lured him, commonly recorded as Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton, and the dealer he said held him in Washington, James H. Birch. He pursued legal action, but in Washington, the legal system placed barriers in front of his voice. In many places, black witnesses could not testify against white defendants. That rule did not merely disadvantage him, it protected the kidnapping economy. Without his testimony, prosecutors struggled. Birch was not convicted in the way Northup hoped, and Brown and Hamilton did not face the kind of justice that would match the scale of the crime, as Northup described it. So Northup turned to a different form of accountability: public record. In 1853, he published 12 Years a Slave, prepared with the assistance of writer and editor David Wilson. Slave narratives were vital to abolitionist work, but Northup stood out for its specificity. It named places, it described routines, it explained how a free man could be transformed into a slave with paperwork theft, drugs, transport, and silence enforced by law. It refused to treat slavery as a distant Southern issue. It placed the beginning of the crime in the capital of the United States. The book arrived in a decade when free black life in the North was under heightened threat, especially after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 empowered slave catchers and endangered even those who had never been enslaved. Northup's story functioned as a warning. If your freedom depends on papers, and papers can be taken, then your freedom depends on whether anyone will listen when you say your name. What happened to Solomon Northup later is less certain. Some accounts suggest he lectured and remained active in anti-slavery circles, but historians have debated details of his later years, and records become thin. That uncertainty is not a footnote, it's part of the American pattern where black lives can be intensely documented at moments of crisis and then vanish again into gaps of archive and neglect. But the meaning of his testimony did not vanish. Northup's narrative exposed a truth that cannot be separated from American history, that slavery was enforced not only by plantations and overseers, but by courts, police, traders, shipping routes, and paperwork. It showed that free was not a simple status, it was a condition that could be attacked, contested, and stolen. And it forces one more uncomfortable question. Northup got his story back because a rare chain of choices lined up: a sympathetic man on a plantation, a letter that reached the right hands, an attorney willing to cross state lines, officials willing to honor documents. What about the people kidnapped who had no one to write for them? What about those whose names were changed beyond recognition, whose families lacked influence, whose captors sold them again and again until no paper could catch up? Northup's case is famous because he returned. That makes it a window into a crime that usually left no witness and no proof. His book becomes, in a way, a memorial to the unrecorded. So when you hear the headline version, "Kidnapped overnight in Washington, then sold into slavery," don't hear it as an impossible exception. Hear it as a measurement of how fragile rights can be when a society builds institutions that refuse to recognize your full humanity. A city that housed the nation's ideals also housed the infrastructure that could erase a free black man by morning. Solomon Northup survived long enough to write it down. He made the country look at what it preferred to keep in shadow. He wrote not to entertain, but to leave proof, names, routes, dates where he could, so denial would have to argue with detail on the page later too. His story asks us to judge liberty not by speeches, but by safeguards, not by symbols, but by whether a person can walk into the night and still be themselves at dawn. And here is the question that remains, sharp and personal. If freedom can be stolen with a drink and a forged story, what does it mean to be free unless you are protected and believed?